Really, what drives us more than anything else is connection. But we have this constant want for autonomy that pulls us away from what we really need. We think that's what we want. We keep grabbing it when the opportunity presents itself. And yet, in so doing, we're constantly, unintentionally severing our connections.
Happiness is going down, isolation. People are having less sex. People are not getting married. They're not having babies. We have the answer, but yet we're not going for it.
Once you accept what you're willing to do and what you're not willing to do, then I think you need to design your life in a way that increases socializing without a lot of friction. We probably should be making more compromises with our eye on the long-term goal of connection rather than the short-term goal of I want to be happy and choose the very perfect thing for me right now. The data show that providing social support is bigger on your happiness than receiving it. Your brain will reward you.
Hi, everyone. So my guest today is evolutionary psychologist William von Hempel. And this is one of those conversations that really puts everything into perspective. We talk about where our fears come from and why connection is so vital to our happiness and how we've evolved, not just biologically, but emotionally and socially to thrive together. Doesn't feel like that sometimes, but it's true. William has this incredible way of taking big ideas like evolution, cooperation, resilience, and breaking them down into everyday insights that actually change how you move through the world. You'll learn why we crave belonging, how we can become more adaptable, and why helping others really might be one of the fastest ways to boost your own well-being. We'll also dive into what evolution has to say about things like aging and self-confidence, competition, and how to stop wasting energy on the things that we can't control. It's science, yes, but it is science with a heart and humanity. And if you've ever wondered why we do the things we do or how to better understand yourself and the people around you, this episode offers clarity, comfort, and a surprising amount of hope. So, welcome to the Gabby Reece Show. Let's go. William, thank you so much. Welcome to the show. I know we were just getting into our math. It's early morning for you and mid-afternoon for me. And I really appreciate you, reaching out all the way from Australia. Thank you.
Oh, totally my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So your latest book, which I really enjoyed reading, Social Paradox, I can't help but think after the amount of years, I feel like you live long enough and you see a pattern in life, which is for whatever reason, the way it's set up is there's so much of our biology that it has purpose and there's reason, but it's always something that we have to try to figure out how to navigate. And I think this book spells it out perfectly. Like when you say, hey, we're in this constant conflict of needing community. And if, any happiness study, the Harvard study, you hear it over and over. It's like, hey, the things that make us feel that sense of belonging and purpose, a purposeful life is connection. But then our personal drive for autonomy and the world is yelling at us all of the time about autonomy and celebrates that.
I totally agree. There's this, I'm sorry, there's an unfortunate mismatch there that you're absolutely right. Where really what drives us, what we've evolved to matter to us more than anything else is connection. But we have this constant want for autonomy that pulls us away from what we really need.
So I know it took you a long time. Like you said, something like 10 years to kind of look at this, ponder it, and write this book. And I'm just wondering from like the most kind of third grade level, when you think about that tension, because you've obviously looked at it from all the directions, and we'll get into that, is if you were to think about like why that tension exists, why do we have this duality? It's sort of like, we understand why we want sugar every chance we get it, because actually it was set up that when we saw it in nature, you never knew when you were going to get it again. So I understand that impulse. But when you've looked at it and really disseminated it down, is there something that showed up for you that you didn't know before you started this project?
Yeah, I never really thought of why we constantly seek autonomy, and yet we see it in so many domains. And just to give you one example, the people are moving in droves to cities. Populations have been shifting there for over 100 years. And yet when we look at the data, people are happier living in the countryside than in the city. And this effect just keeps repeating itself. We're alone now more than we ever were before, but we're happier when we're connected. In the 1970s, when I was a kid, people were more likely to get together with their neighbors at least twice a week than they were not at all. Now we're more likely to never get together with our neighbors at all than we are to get together with them at least twice a week. And so in case after case, we're separating ourselves from our worlds. And I never stopped to think about why that might possibly be. And it was finally, I think it was my editor who got on my case, and she's like, well, you're not answering the question, and so I sat down for a while. And what I realized is that we don't know this, of course, but what I believe is that because our ancestors had to be connected, connection was so important to them and their lives depended on it, their connection needs were always met. And what that meant is that autonomy was like sugar. It was a little bit rare in our environment. You could hardly ever have it, but when you could, you grabbed for it because autonomy is important too. And now the problem is that autonomy is everywhere, just like sugar is everywhere now. And so we've got the situation where we think that's what we want. We keep grabbing it when the opportunity presents itself. And yet in so doing, we're constantly unintentionally severing our connections.
I think it's such an interesting idea. And you talk about it in your book where it's almost like strategizing or designing for community. My husband and I, we do that at our house where, we've built our work into our lives so we could be with our children when they were growing up. We sort of have an open door policy. People will come and train at our house, even if we don't get involved with them. Let's say we're doing something else. And I always say it sort of takes an extra effort. Like maybe you have dinner for people and you clean up, it's like, you plan for the food, you organize it and you clean up, and it is extra work, but the return, once you've lived like that long enough, I think it becomes intuitive. Like you understand that you need it.
Yeah, I think you're right. It makes you much happier. And the problem is that I think you've hit the nail on the head with the extra effort. Every time we form a connection, it takes a little bit of effort. You're my next door neighbor and I'm out of coffee beans. And I think, oh, well, Gabby has great coffee. I could go grab a coffee with her. But then I think, but she could pop by anytime. And now I'll have to give her coffee and I might be busy that day. And so even if I'm fond of you, even if I enjoy our connections, I'll have to clean up. All those little calculations go into it. And we lead these crazy busy lives now that make every one of those little costs way heavier. But I also agree with you that the reality is once you get accustomed to paying them, then they don't feel heavier at all anymore. They just feel like, well, that's part of my day. And what you realize is all those connections that I'm constantly enabling and forming by my open door policy or whatever strategies I have that work in my life actually make me so much happier that the trivialities of cleaning up, just disappear.
They do. And they almost become automatic. And, sometimes if I'm having like a little personal temper tantrum, about things, my husband and I have often joked that you're really fortunate if you can do it, if you can host people, if you can share with them, you're actually the fortunate one. And I feel like if there's these switches that you can make, and I really appreciated, in the book, you're talking about designing for connection. Mm-hmm. And I think that's even your approach, like your framework, your attitude of, yeah, you know what? It's a little bit of a pain in the ass, or maybe I'm not in really a mood to see that person, but I can get over it.
Yeah. And the thing for me is coming up with strategies that get yourself there to turn it into a habit. And there's a couple of key things that you need to do to make things habits. And one of them is not decide each time. And so your example of an open door policy is perfect. You guys don't wake up in the morning and go, should we have an open door policy today? What's our schedule look like, right? It's just already, that's the plan. That's the default. It's a little bit like brushing your teeth. You don't wake up and go, I wonder if I should brush my teeth today. And so if you had to decide every time, lots of times it would just never happen. And so the key is, in my mind, is try to minimize the friction points, try to make those connections as easy as possible. Try to think about whenever you're doing things alone, could you do those in ways that aren't alone anymore? And training is a perfect example. Lots and lots of people train. Why are you training alone? And then the final thing is make those decisions in advance, make them a default decision so you don't have to keep deciding every time.
Yeah. What are the ways, I'm just curious for you, that you just bring that in? And I know you have a young child, which has its whole other set of things, because you don't want to always to be forced with like the parents of the kid, parents of the kids, sort of your kids' friends. But are there things you do? Because there's a couple different ways. I feel like you as the individual person, the man, and then you as a couple and as a family. How did you build it into your life?
Well, it's very purposive. I think in advance, okay, I know I'm crazy busy. I know I have so many demands on my time, but and if I let myself, I'll be terrible. I'll be just, working all the time and sneaking off to train and doing everything by myself, and makes me very unhappy when I do that. And so I know this is a bad idea. And so I think, okay, well, I don't want to, there's nothing wrong with being friends with random parents, but I'd like to be thoughtful about it. And so some good friends of ours had an economist and an engineer who are crazy busy too, had babies, twin girls that were born right before my daughter. And we thought, oh, perfect. Let's default that we get together with them at least once every 2 weeks, no matter what. And so we just have this time set up where the families get together, the kids play, and they've been doing that since they were brand new babies. And, some weeks I think, oh no, I've got so much to do. But if I make sure that time, I can't skip that no matter what. That's like breakfast, right? You have to do it when the time comes. Then of course it happens. And so I don't have to decide. It's a commitment that I need to make. And it makes a huge difference.
Yeah. And then, and because people are so busy, I also feel like they're starving for their own personal time. I mean, you have your work and your relationship and your daughter and all these other commitments, but how do you do that as some guys go play golf or they find these ways? Cause I also think women do it more, I think intuitively. We connect by nature with girlfriends. How did you build this in?
Yeah. So it is harder. Men aren't good at it. Men are far more likely to say they have no friends who they share their emotions with at all. They have no friends who give them emotional support than women are. Now, admittedly, for both men and women, in the last 50 years, it's gotten worse in pretty much every industrialized country where we have good data because people spend so much time alone. But what it does mean is that as a guy, I'm thoughtful about, well, how do I make sure that I maintain my connections with other men and so, who are also just as bad, if not worse than I am? And so one of my good friends is a biologist who is, terrible on every form of scheduling. And so I always just say, all right, when are we getting together next? And we just put in our calendars when we have our weekly coffee or so. And then that morning I say, hey, are we still on? And it just requires that level of clicking in his brain because he doesn't think about it otherwise. Now, we always have a great time when we get together. We end up, canceling sometimes because that's what guys do. And we connect slightly differently than I connect with women or in other settings. There's a lot of, guys talk a lot of trash and they give each other a lot of crap, but underneath that, they have the positivity is there as well. And so for me, it's just an issue of, I know full well what both I'm like and what my gender is like in general. And I just try to work around that.
Yeah. And I feel like sometimes, and I know we live in a time where everybody says we're all the same, but there are some real differences biologically by the way we connect and strive for autonomy, male and female. Have you seen in doing this research, is sort of one juggling that a little better, this struggle between community and autonomy? Are women sort of bridging this gap a little better? And the other thing I can't help but think, and even being a female who comes from sports, I wrestled a lot internally with trying to be a killer. It's like it's required. You were training. That's really what the end goal was. And there was always a part of me that was more uncomfortable. And yet, I'd look at my male counterparts and it was like a switch. Like, okay, we're we're friends. Now we're enemies. Like all that ease of that switch. So I wondered, what you learned when you were exploring this.
Yeah. So first of all, yes, women have a much better balance than men do. They are much more connection oriented than men on average. Of course, we're always speaking about averages. And so as a consequence, they're more likely to meet their connection needs in a world where everybody's not meeting them as well. Now, with that said, in America right now, about half of women no longer have close friends who give them emotional support who they can talk to. Well, that's pretty bad, right? For men, it's less than a third, but still women are not doing nearly as well as they used to. In the United States, 100 years ago, less than 1% of people lived alone. Now it's 1 in 7. So 1 in 100 to 1 in 7 in just a little over 100 years. And so women are often living alone as well. They're way less likely to get married. Not that marriage is this end all and be all, but it's a sign of connection, right? And so in many, many ways, both men and women are not meeting their connection needs, although given that women started out in a much better place, they've ended out in a much better place. Right. With that said, you brought up an important point when you notice the costs of these high connection needs, which is that women also, although they can be just as competitive as men, unfortunately, because women form smaller circles of tighter friends than men do, and they do in every society we know of, and they have across history as long as we know of. And in fact, chimpanzees do the same thing. It seems to be pretty biological. Women are less forgiving of competitive behavior in other women. And so for men, it's a switch easily. You're my friend right now. Now you're my enemy on the squash court. Now you're my friend again when it's over. And guys love being with somebody who they can compete with fiercely and then hang out and discuss it afterwards. And women tend to be less forgiving about that. Now, remember, these are always averages, but it does mean that women pay a cost for their own competitive behavior that men don't have to pay.
I've thought about this a lot because I would pay attention to the girls that didn't seem to struggle with it as much. And I always found that a lot of them had brothers.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they were taught early, like, hey, this isn't personal. And I find it so fascinating because you figure since Title IX, since 1970, they've been encouraging women in a certain way. And it's like stand apart. But yet the minute a woman will do this standing apart or push herself out there, it isn't the men that are offended. It's the women.
Yeah.
It's so, and I imagine though, because when I think about it, I go, okay, well, this too must be biological. Because if, let's say, men were out hunting and we were together, right? This is where even gossip has come from. It's like, we have to exchange information and you tell me who's safe and who's going to help me and, who can I rely on? And I somehow feel like that's still somehow connected to biologically, we're not meant to women, we're not meant to be so cutthroat with each other. I don't know.
I think that's right. That men and women evolved with almost all the same pressures on them, but in a few key ways, those pressures were different. And one of the most important of those ways surrounds child rearing, where by and large in hunter-gatherer societies, women do the brunt of the effort. No surprise. Women still do the brunt of the effort. And so nobody's going to be shocked to learn that. But the consequence of that is that, imagine raising your children in a world where you have very few worldly possessions, where around every corner there's danger, both from pathogens and predators. Well, you want to form tight connections with other women so you can engage in this kind of village level monitoring of each other's kids. And the way women have historically done that is they form tight relationships with a few other women, and then they always go out maybe gathering together, and they bring all of their children with them. So they have all eyes on the kids, hoping that the kids will, keep them safe, keeping in mind that in that environment, about 40% of children didn't make it to adulthood. So parents lost a lot of kids. And so it was super important what women were trying to do to keep their kids safe and healthy. And that meant forming really tight bonds that you could count on somebody no matter what, which means betrayal is that ends it. One betrayal, if she let your kid wander off and get eaten by a lion even once, that's one time too many. But for men, betrayal is not a big deal. Oh, so you promised to lion hunt with me today and you went with somebody else? Fine, I'll choose another partner, but you still may be available to me tomorrow. And so throughout cultures, throughout history, men form these broad relationships that are kind of loose, where there can be a lot of competition and betrayal, and women form small relationships that are really tight and there's no room for betrayal. And so it puts a lot of pressure on. There's some advantages. Women are more connected. They have a lot of positives, but there's some negatives as well.
Yeah. What did they say? It's like, I want his head on the platter. No, you can have the whole kingdom. Yeah, no, my husband always jokes, I have 3 daughters, no sons. And he's always like, oh, women are so much more unforgiving. And I find it so fascinating because here you have this idea of man masculinity, pushy, but in a way, like they kind of get over it. And the conversely, like with women, it's like, oh, sensitive, intuitive, all these things, but like in another way, kind of brutal.
Yeah.
That it's really very, very fascinating. I will say, though, I have learned, my husband does a sport that's pretty dangerous. And, it was sort of like, hey, listen, I don't even care how you act on the land. If you will come and get me when we're in the water and you'll put your life on your line, that in a way is sort of the only requirement. And you talk about, though, in your book, though, that in a way there is part of that, like your skill level, but it's also kind of who's sort of agreeable.
Yeah.
So where's the line?
Yeah. So if you come back to, what's the purpose of connection and autonomy? And connection evolved so that we could keep each other safe. Suddenly 6 million years ago or so, we've left the trees and now there's all these predators that we need to look out for. So we form these tight bonds. And you can see the connection in our psychology just by looking, for example, the color of our eyes. Chimpanzees have all brown eyes, and so they disguise the direction of their gaze. But humans have evolved to have white around the colored part of their eyes. So when they look off lower left, immediately I've advertised that I'm looking that way. So you can, and what that tells me is I want you to know because you're going to help me. If it's a threat, you're going to help me deal with the threat. If it's a challenge, an opportunity, you're going to help me get the opportunity. And so we've formed these tight bonds that our chimpanzee cousins never form. But we also need to stand out a little bit. We need to somehow be the one that other people pick, that they find valuable. And so in our ancestral societies, and autonomy is what gets us to stand out. It's how we pursue where we have best prospects. In our ancestral societies, that was all around hunting and gathering and making arrows, being a good medicine person, maybe telling stories, all the things that matter in your group. And so the assumption was, so long as you have minimal competence in those domains, you can stay. You're bringing in more calories than you cost, so to speak. Of course, we love people who have maximal confidence who are really, really good things. But the problem is that if you're really, really good at things, but you don't look out for me, it doesn't really help me that much. So you may be the best hunter, but if when we go hunting together, you abandon me or don't share nicely, then I don't really want to hunt with you. And so the remarkable fact is that when you look at what hunter-gatherers do when they pick their hunting partners in the morning, there's always a minimal level of competence. If you're an incompetent hunter, nobody wants to go with you. But once you pass that minimal level, what they really want is kindness. Somebody who's going to look out for them, who's going to share, who's going to play nice, so to speak. And we see that all over the world.
But then you share that the perception of warmth or kindness or being nice, let's put that in quotes, nice, is sometimes related to, less competent.
Yeah.
And, sort of more skilled or more talented or more capable is oftentimes, equals somebody who's a little more cold or, not quite as affable. That part I thought was interesting because, you sort of, the reasoning is it's like, hey, listen, to sort of be good at something, you do have to be disconnected, right? You have to be focused. You have to practice. You have to work hard. So you're not going to be as loose and malleable and kind of easygoing and available. But I'm wondering when I see that, because I could completely see that. I have also seen, though, a lot of times, especially men that do something that is very, very dangerous, I feel like they almost come full circle with it, that they become so good at it, or they've been in so many bad situations that then they end up being sort of the kindest and the most polite or the softest. And I was just wondering, when you were visiting these ideas and these concepts, what showed up for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so in principle, when we become autonomy machines, when we dive into our sport or our art or our science or whatever it is we love, and we just train relentlessly and study relentlessly to get good at that, that's when we're being autonomy machines, we're pushing everyone away. But in principle, the purpose of that is to therefore be more valuable to form connections with. And so if you look at the great athletes and musicians and all the people who have extraordinary talent, if they've done the right thing, what makes them happy, they've taken their talent and then they've reconnected with everybody. If they've done the wrong thing, they've taken their talent and they've just put themselves separate from everybody, and they're probably not happy as a consequence. This is what I call sad success stories, where they've got enormous accolades, but they've got no one to share them with. And so in an ideal world, you realize, I'm trying to be the greatest at X, not so that I can just do this by myself forever, but so that I can reconnect with my community. And I suspect that guys who do or men and women who do these crazy extreme sports that are highly risky, right? That they see the value of connection on a more regular basis because, all of us think, oh, I don't want to die alone. But all of us think that's something I'll worry about in 40 years. But every time I strap my skis on or get on the board or whatever, if what I'm doing is really risky, then that thought probably occurs to me a lot more often.
Yeah, and you see it in serious fighters or military guys. I see that trait over and over and over, and I'm like, it's like we always joke, you have to be careful of the really polite, quiet guy, who's asking everyone we should probably calm down, and it's just you see that trait. So these are people that maybe also. I think there's something to be said for when you understand there are someone always greater than you. Someone more talented. I think faith makes people a little smaller in that productive way. But it is fascinating. Do you think with women, I am really curious because it is something that is harder to do in roles of leadership or in striving for autonomy. Has there been conversations around how much harder it is to jump into that gear and then jump back? Like, let's say, okay, because jumping to serve your family in some ways is a lot easier, even though it's hard. Like you come home from a long day of work and you're out there kicking ass and you're the CEO, and then you come home and it's like, this is the hard stuff. I've wondered if there was any tricks or ideas or things that especially females have learned, or males, I'd love to hear both, that they learned how to kind of click in and out of that.
Yeah, it's really tricky, right? Because if your job or sport or activity requires you to be in killer mode, it's hard to set that aside and pick up your 2-year-old and wipe their little face and switch back out. And on average, what we see is that women tend to be better at that. And I do think it's because connection sits more in the front of their brain. And for men, it sits more in the back of their brain. But when I talk to guys like, hockey players, and for that matter, going back to your example, commandos, people who are in these very rough lives, when they talk about when they first start doing it, it takes forever to come down from the adrenaline. So I remember talking with some Australian commandos in there about the first firefight they're in. And when they come home totally keyed up after bullets are flying, but after bullets are flying 6 or 7 times or a lot more, then it becomes something that's a lot easier to get back out of. It's just that the adrenaline of any kind of competition is antithetical to the caring that we give to others. And so, for example, we know that, just to take a longer term example, men have much higher testosterone when they're single than they do when they're partnered. And it goes down even more when they have babies, because testosterone's not a good having babies hormone. It's all about, conflict and competition. It's not about caring and nurturing. And so those two systems are hard to bridge.
Right. Oh my goodness. It's so true. Is the brain different? Like if you took a single male at 50 and a married man at 50 throw a kid in there, why not? I mean, the poor guy's already lost some of his testosterone. Does the brain look different?
The brain does look a little different. It's hard for us to see it at a structural level, but it's not hard to see it at a connection level. And so, I remember I did this study, about 10 years. So I was a young man then. I was in my mid 40s, and I did this study, where we looked at testosterone levels among skateboarders, and we brought in this model who was working with us, and she would then do some of the filming, and it would drive the testosterone levels of the skateboarders up, and then they would do more complicated tricks, and they'd fall more often because they're taking bigger risks, and it was just for fun. But anyway, I thought, well, why not send in my own testosterone at the same time? And I'm just curious, right? So I put mine in the collection, send it off to the lab. And when it comes back, I can't find myself on the graph. And then finally my grad student says, Bill, and down there at the bottom, at the 12-year-old girl level, basically was my testosterone levels compared to all these young men who are single and me with, married and with little kids. And so, yeah, there's just, it's inevitable. It's good for you. You can, it doesn't determine your life. I mean, it just means that I train a little bit harder to get the same outcome that I would before, right?
Yeah.
But
I used to joke with my husband and go like, why do you want to be monogamous? You know, like, I'm just curious, like as a friend, I'm not trying to set you up as a wife because I don't believe in that. And he's like, because I'd like to be happy, you know?
yeah, exactly.
But I think it's that trade-off. So, you know, we're in cities, we have phones, everything is curated to our lives, right? We have autonomy in every possible way. I mean, everybody has their own channel now.
Yeah.
Right. So happiness is going down, isolation, lack of connection. When you sit at where you sit with all the information that you have, knowing what we're not going to get rid of, right? Like we say, you know, social media is not great for us. Oh, the phone, and no one's really doing it. It's sort of like food and exercise. We sort of have the answers. So if we were sort of going to push someone off in the trajectory of like, listen, in navigating the world that we live in, here's some new ideas that you can add to maybe help at least with the connection part, because, you know, people are having less sex. People are not getting married. They're not having babies, all of these things. And I find it fascinating because we have the answer, but yet we're not going for it.
Yeah. And so, you know, you could sort of get this, kind of misty-eyed, nostalgic view. We should go back to the 1950s and join an Elks Lodge and get together and put on a funny hat and hang out with our friends. But nobody's going to do that, right? It's just not going to happen. And so once you accept what you're willing to do and what you're not willing to do, then I think you need to design your life in a way that increases socializing without a lot of friction. And so I remember reading an article in the New York Times where this guy, it was an op-ed piece where he decided to reconnect with all of his old friends. And he put out huge amounts of effort, went around, you know, gathered them all up, got together with them one by one. And then he ends by asking, well, am I going to keep doing this? I don't think so. It's just too much effort, right? And so that's no good because in the end, we don't end up any happier. But what you can do is say, all right, well, what are things that I'm doing alone and how could I do them with others? Ideally face to face and in person. So if I like to train or run or swim or whatever, do that with somebody else. But if you can't do it face to face and in person, do it over e-connections. And so in my case, my little sister lives in London. She and I both love to do the crossword puzzles. We were doing them alone pre-COVID. But COVID hits and now everybody's locked down. And we thought, well, why not? When she wakes up, it's my late afternoon, but she'll make herself a coffee. She'll call me and we do the crosswords together. And of course, what that means is not only do we do a crossword puzzle, but we also chit chat the whole time. And it's way nicer. Mm-hmm. And so if you find those activities that you're doing alone and then you do them either in person with others directly there, or at the very least via e-connections, might as well take advantage of the phone and all that kind of stuff. It makes you a lot happier and it reconnects you in ways that you don't realize how important they are.
Yeah. And somehow, you know, what you're saying too, to me strikes like these don't have to be monumental moments, right? They can just be these consistent little moments to drop into someone's life and look at their eyeballs, even if it's FaceTime, which is one of the good things about technology. Mm-hmm. And just sort of be like, oh yeah, I got that puppy and how's that going? Or, you know, how's Lenny doing? Or whatever the things are that really are life is about the everyday. It's never these grand moments.
Yeah, that's a hugely important point. Life is about the everyday and it's about the little things. And we've evolved to do to create what's called shared reality. And it's super important because if you and I are members of a hunter-gatherer group and we see other hunter-gatherers coming over the horizon, we need to decide, we need to agree they're a threat or they're an opportunity. And that holds for everything we encounter. And if we can't agree, we're going to get wiped out. We may make the wrong decision if we agree, but at least we're together. And the only way that we can come to this constant shared reality is by sharing our the bits and bobs of everyday life. And so, you know, the really nice thing about the way things work now is you can connect on FaceTime for 2 minutes to see the new puppy or to say, God, this is the best coffee ever. You should join me tomorrow. I'm at whatever place. You know, all the little things in life where we used to just let them go because it was too hard to connect. Now, at least the phone and those things allow us to have somebody else be there with us in those moments. And so I think that's really important. Now, of course, face to face is always better, but connecting on those on FaceTime and all those things is 10 zillion times better than not at all. And like you say, it can be little tiny connections in the same way that when I go to the bakery, if I go to the same one every day and she smiles at me from behind the counter and makes my coffee just how I like it, that's what humans evolved to do.
This podcast is brought to you by Troscriptions. Troscriptions has created science-backed, pharmaceutical-grade, physician-designed, and rigorously tested formulas delivered in a completely novel way to help you address things like energy, more focus, more sleep, less anxiety, and better immune system function. So I like it because it's this idea of really, I'm on a mission to simplify, but accelerate my path to health optimization. You're not going to get away from, eating good, moving, looking at sunlight, having friends, but these are the nice little edges you can do to health optimize. And I've been a huge fan for the brand for several months now. I've been taking it ever since I met Scott Schur, and I discovered Troscriptions through them. And they're a company that uses the most novel delivery method on the planet. It's something called the boucle troche. I just love the name. I personally just call it a troche, but that its official name. Troscription uses this innovative delivery system. So the boucle troche, which is a small, very small dissolvable lozenge that is placed between the upper cheek and the gum. So it's very easy to use. Sometimes I'll be honest, I just drink it and eat it, but usually I put it in my mouth. They're extremely fast acting, typically like 15 to 30 minutes because they infuse their ingredients directly into the cheek mucosa. So this approach bypasses your digestive system altogether. So it leads to a faster onset and higher bioavailability, which compared to traditional oral supplements, those can take up to almost 2 hours to take effect. And the other important thing is this is a physician-led, all their formulas are physician-led. Their products are formulated by a team of 4 physicians with real-life experience. They're pharmaceutical-grade quality. Troscription sources high-quality ingredients globally. It subjects them to, rigorous testing to ensure unparalleled purity and potency. Super important. They've even got some really cool novel ingredients and really also something that I know a lot of us think about when we're doing something like this, precision dosing. Each troche is meticulously calibrated and scored, allowing users to easily adjust or titrate their dosage to meet their individual needs. This is really important. It's made in the USA. All Troscription products are crafted in the US, adhering to strict quality standards to ensure superior efficacy and safety. So they've really thought about it all. They've got a lot of really interesting, diverse products in their line. They have the blue carnitine. It gives you a little bit of focus and productivity. The just blue, it decreases inflammation and improves cellular health and energy. They have Tro Calm. I love this one. Promotes relaxation and stress relief. And I think my favorite is the Tro Z. Makes it easier to fall asleep, stay asleep, and wake up feeling rested. And they've got something for your immune system, Tromune. Helps with immune health, increases deep sleep, and fights infection. So if you're really curious, they have a completely new way to optimize your health. Give it a try at troscriptions.com/Gabby, troscriptions.com/Gabby, or enter Gabby at checkout, Gabby, and you will get 10% off your first order. That's troscriptions.com/Gabby for 10% off your first order. It's interesting to see. I have kids from, and I know you have big ranges too. I have a oldest 29 and a youngest 17. And so that's some interesting developments with technology in that span of those times. And I know you have a good span between your kids, but are the younger people's brains, and by the way, I am not picking on the next generation. I'm trying to continue to get educated so I can be compassionate to understand what they're navigating, so that if I can be, like a better, more understanding parent and adult, then I'm trying to understand. But I'm wondering sometimes if their brains, they talk about their brains being rewired differently because of technology, which even makes the face-to-face, the ability to pay attention, to be whatever the things are, more socially awkward. Did that come up in any parts of this part of the conversation?
Well, it is the case that the world that children are growing up in today is quite different than the world that I grew up in, and even different from the world that you grew up in. And technology is much more interfaced in that world. Now, the good news is that the technology is getting better rapidly. I mean, you and I are having a conversation from thousands of miles apart. We can see each other. It's all happening in real time, but it's not perfect by any means. I feel like I'm making eye contact with you, but to your end, it probably doesn't look that way because it's not perfectly lined up on the screen. And if we were actually talking face to face, our pupils would actually dilate and shrink again in synchrony with each other. We would get all this neural synchrony. And a fair bit of that is lost when we've got this two-dimensional medium between us. That's one way that our kids are getting rewired differently. They have these two-dimensional experiences all the time that we just didn't grow up with ourselves. I think probably a second way that they're different than we are is that there's so many opportunities for so many forms of entertainment that they're probably less likely to turn to each other than they are to turn to their phone or some other source of entertainment that fits exactly what they want. And that just wasn't possible for prior generations. And there's pluses to that because I played 10 gazillion rounds of Monopoly, which is really not a very interesting game when you do it more than once or twice, and certainly nothing special for brain development there. And, Malcolm Gladwell pointed out the kind of video games and stuff we play now are complicated and interesting and probably good for your brain. But the downside is I remember walking by a construction site the other day, and all the guys who used to sit out and just, shoot the shit with each other and chat are now looking at their own phones. Like there's no connection there at all anymore. And what was great about their job compared to mine is they've all this connection constantly, and now that's being disrupted. Mm-hmm. And so I do think technology can help us, but the problem is that we often use it to replace. And when we use it to replace, we end up at risk of all sorts of social anxiety, loneliness, etc. But when we use it to augment, we're much better off in those kinds of ways.
I feel like, again, when you go around the block a few times, I mean, I'm 55. It's like, I've seen a little bit, not much, but a little. I think you start to realize in life, like, when they talk about dark and light and, good and evil, it's like, I think that's in everything. Yes. And it's almost like getting a relationship with, and even within us, like I have these two driving forces that kept in check. They have their purpose. It's like anger is a really powerful, positive emotion used correctly. It can motivate, you can get shit done, whatever. It's almost getting a relationship with what is wildly uncomfortable about being a human being, like, the bad stuff about us and living in ways, you talk about this a lot, how quickly our environment changed, but yet our biology hasn't. Yeah. And so we're in this evolutionary mismatch. Being a parent yourself of, again, a gap, I'd love to know if you have a strategy in place, because this is always the one for me. People go, how are you, parenting with the technology? I'm like, I've failed miserably, especially with my youngest daughter, Yeah. If anything in this process really has occurred to you, like that you didn't have to really manage with your older kids, that you will, with your younger daughter.
Yeah, I'm intimidated by it because I don't know how to do it either. And the problem is that you can't be the only parent who says, no, you can't be on Instagram or Facebook or whatever, because then your kid is a pariah, right? They don't know what's going on. I was the only kid in my elementary school who wasn't allowed a TV. And so I'd rock up to school in elementary school, and they're all talking about the $6 million man. And unless I was able to sneak over to my friend's house, I didn't know what had happened in the latest episode, and I was left out. And that's way more important now than it was when I wasn't watching the $6 million man, because the socializing is actually happening on the platforms. And so now you don't even know about the party, much less have you been involved in, discussing it or whatever. And so it's kind of an unfixable problem at the individual level. It has to be a problem that's fixed more at the societal level. And the good news about that, so here in Australia, where I am now, social media is now banned for minors. And in America, what's happening is cell phones are being banned at schools. That's happening all over the US. And also there are all sorts of laws where now you can't sign up for a social media account without parental consent. Now that's only just getting started. There's only, I think, 9 states who have a law on the books or that'll soon be on the books for that. But the good news is once that becomes a norm everywhere, then it's easier as a parent to regulate those things because you're not turning your kid into a pariah. But it's weird because what that really means is you're offloading a lot of your parenting decisions to others in ways that you would prefer not to, right?
Yeah, I know. I mean, it's the billion dollar question that if you ask, I've been to places with people who've created these tech companies and I'm like, I'm just curious, how do you manage it? And either they say my kids don't have it. Mm-hmm. That's my favorite.
Yeah. Isn't that ironic?
Yeah. The big guys at the top, a lot of their kids don't have it because they know, or they say they don't do it well either.
Yeah. And I don't know if I'm going to do it well. I think I got really lucky, with the age of my first two. They're 25 and 24 right now. Yeah. And so most of their friends didn't have phones, for example, when they were growing up. It was a little too early for them, but I'm not getting lucky the second time through. And so there's this really lovely book called Irresistible by Adam Alter. Adam was actually an undergraduate of mine way back in the day when he and I were both in Sydney. And he talks about how, these social media platforms and the phones and all that are just designed to get under the radar and sneak under our defenses in so many ways. And it's so hard for us to stop doing it. And then as a parent, everything's compounded. I can control myself a whole lot easier than I can control my child. Even if my child is inclined to listen to me, which, there's huge variability in those ways, right? And so from my perspective, I find the problem super intimidating. I don't know the answer, but I do know that in an ideal world, you'd have your kid on social media less rather than more. I do know that social media introduces all sorts of problems with social isolation, particularly if it replaces rather than augments. If it's used to augment, I think it can be wonderful. But if it's used to replace, it's ghastly.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. I'm always ecstatic to hear my youngest daughter talking to her friends on the phone. When I was a kid, right, we would get yelled at, like, get off the phone.
Exactly.
Now I'm ecstatic when she's talking on the phone versus clacking away or Snapchatting or whatever the million things. They're actually talking. I'm like, great.
Yeah, I feel the same. And I have to admit, I was a little shocked to hear you say you're 55 because I would have guessed you're at least 15 years younger than that. So I thought we were different generations.
That's why I was like, listen, I'm with you.
Yeah, but we're really not that far apart. I'm only a little bit older than you are. And yeah, we grew up in such a different world. And so in my case, I remember when my son would be in his bedroom yelling at the TV and I'm like, what's going on? And then I realized he has a headset on. He's with his friends, even though they're not in the house, and they're playing the same shoot 'em up game. And I like that, right? Because that's like being on the phone. It's like playing a game. But of course, it's even better if they're out in the yard kicking a soccer ball.
Yeah. I would imagine if someone was guilty of it, it would be females. Is there something that there was ever conversations around people not going for enough autonomy and being either stuck in, just always being of service and of connection to people? Like, you can kind of see where that would happen, especially if you had a lot of little kids and maybe you and your partner decided that you were going to stay home or whatever that was. Was there sort of like, hey, you got to calm down with the connection and actually go do your own thing?
That used to be a huge problem. And so my generation, I was born in 1963. So my birth year is the first year that women equaled men at university. And that's a really good sign of just women. That's one way to choose to do your own thing, right? And those opportunities just weren't there before. My mother's generation and her mother's generation, there's all sorts of, quite remarkable stories of what they went through where they had to sacrifice all their career aspirations to raise kids or whatever. It still happens in smaller towns and it still happens in more traditional societies, but in big industrialized places like the United States, Europe, Australia, it's far less likely to be the problem that somebody's drowning in connection and doesn't have enough autonomy. It's 90% of the time it goes the other way. When it does happen, as you suggested, it tends to happen to women. They put aside what they really want in order to fulfill that role.
Yeah. And what if, I feel like we go through phases of this as in our adulthood where it's like you're striving and you're building and it's tough on even the person And it could be perceived as you're in pursuit of, just accomplishing and achieving, but sort of that's actually kind of what it takes in little pockets. You've maybe experienced it in your own career, right? So is there a way that you could soften that blow to the relationships in your life? Like even just by communicating, if it's to a partner or, a friend, like, hey, I know I'm not as available as I maybe need to be, but this is sort of what I'm doing and thinking. Is
Yeah.
that even effective in sort of preserving the relationships around you?
In principle, it is. In principle, it's a great idea. But the problem is that we all know people who tell you it's the equivalent of saying, I'll scale back at work once I make my first million. And then who scaled back once they made their first million? They just ramped it up to try to make their first 10 million, right? And so we all know people who make the mistake of thinking that this hard push for autonomy is a goal in its own right. It's not a goal in order to make you a better connection person. And so it is the case that lots of us plan to do that. And many of us even follow through on those plans. We get to the success point. We're the autonomy machines we want to be when we're young. And then we become more relationship oriented. But many of us wait way too long before that happens. And so if you're the partner of the person who's 25 and saying, I've just got to do this for 2 years, it would be right for you to wonder, is that two really two, or are we talking 20? Because often it is 20. People lose sight.
Yeah. It's interesting too, because then I think about too, like, let's say you were working 12 hours, 14 hours a day, and then all of a sudden you could say, okay, when I am at home, I'm going to be totally present, which would have value, right?
Right.
But then there's this other part where then you then completely lose yourself. Because if you're just in pursuit, you don't take care of yourself, and then you don't have, or you don't have time for those relationships. So it's our world has been set up to make this a really interesting dance.
It is. And it's a dance that our ancestors just didn't have to join.
Right.
They didn't work nearly as hard as we did. There was nothing that they could do for the future. And when they're practicing their art, it might be, let's say, making better arrows or drawing or carving. They sat around with each other and did it all the time. They didn't live in a world where they pursued their own strengths alone. And unfortunately for us, our technology and our wealth has created a world where we can pursue our strengths alone. Shooting 1 million free throws, whatever your thing is, you're by yourself basically. And it's not ideal. We weren't designed for that.
I know. I loved how you were like, well, actually wealth and education has really been, and it like a thing for us. I'm just curious. I have to ask, cause I'm always curious about this. Is there anything you have learned? Because again, I have a big span of parenting years myself. Mm-hmm. If there's something you didn't know or that you didn't realize with your, first go around, that now in a way you've had this opportunity to learn from parenting, that you sort of have a philosophy that's really been supportive of parenting to you?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think of my adult daughter who, do you know the song "The Cat's in the Cradle" about this father who never spent time with his kid till it was too late? And so when I was younger, parenting on round one, I always had my laptop open, and it was always my view that the kids could interrupt me at any time, and I would just put it away and play with them. Now they have the view that I was working and that I was less interruptible than I thought I was, right? And so she would make fun of me and sing this "Cat's in the Cradle" song, and she still does that. She still teases me about that. And so I'm now trying to be much more like, it's like you said, I want to go home and be present, right? And so I want to close the laptop and just put it away so that my child realizes, oh no, I'm 100% here for you. Mm-hmm. I'm happy to interact. And, children, my youngest daughter is only 2, just about to be turned 2. And then they can be super lovely and delightful at that age, but they can also be boring as, there's not the conversation leaves something to be desired, right? So you can't force yourself to do that for too many hours a day unless you really love that. But what you can do is revel in it for shorter periods and then, back and forth, trade off with the other parent, things like that. And I'm trying to be much more present in those kind of cases than I know I was the first time.
Yeah. And what about time? I'm I sort of at a place, especially because you do have, adult children where you understand, and it's nothing to get freaked out about. It just is what it is about, like, oh, in 20 years, I'll be this age if I'm fortunate. And wow, it's like, is there anything new? And imagine work like this is also keeps refocusing for you about what's really important. Is there anything you've added in your practices? Because you are kind of probably more appreciative of time.
Yeah, I try to, the data show that one way to be happy is to try to be present, but our minds evolved to be future oriented. That's what we're so good at. That's what makes us a success. This big piece of turf right here can simulate tomorrow and go, oops, Bill, you're not ready for that tomorrow that it's going to happen. You've got to do these 14 things. And so it's a constant internal battle to be present. And we're really good at it when we plan it in advance. And so I say, I love the symphony. I personally don't, but imagine I love the symphony. I'm going to get tickets. I'm going to go there on Thursday night. And yet those same people, I don't know if you remember this wonderful example when Joshua Bell, one of the world's greatest violinists, was hired by the Washington Post to busk in the metro. And so here's the world's greatest violinist on a Stradivarius violin, and everybody walks by him. Nobody even stops to listen for more than a minute except small children. Now, the thing is that we're not good about that. We're not good at going, oh my goodness, what am I walking by? What's happening right here? And so because I know we're not good at it, I try really hard to allow my attention to be grabbed by the present rather than being caught up in the future. Because you know that all those people who walk by him were thinking it's the start of their day. They're thinking, oh, I've got to deal with my boss. I've got to do this. I've got to do that. Rather than, I've never heard a violinist of that caliber standing in the metro busking when he's going to be playing in the symphony tomorrow night. I'm probably going to pay a fortune, have trouble parking, et cetera, because I'm good at it when I'm planning and I'm not good at it when I didn't. And so I try really hard to make myself better about unplanned, wonderful opportunities because they're constant.
Yeah, they are. It's interesting to me, and having all these conversations. I've said, you can read every book that's out there, and the secrets, the truths, all the information, all the keys to true sense of, let's call it peace and fulfillment. Happiness is a different construct. I think that gets us in trouble because the world's like, you're not happy. It's like, well, I feel pretty good, but I'm not like, I think that's okay. I think joy and peace are pretty incredible emotions.
Yes.
But that, you really, I think what I really appreciate is you map it out. Like you really define it for people. Like, hey, the world that we're in is kind of set up not to keep us in the places and the connections that make us feel good. And you give sort of really active ideas that people can do it. I am curious though, if there was anything, I don't know, that maybe you would wish for us, as a global society. Obviously, Western developed technology oriented countries are going to have to battle it a lot more than maybe third world and even, poorer countries. But do you think that there's going to be anything that we do to course correct? Because people have never felt, lonelier or more unhappy or more isolated. And do you wonder about that, especially after doing this book?
I do wonder about that a lot because unfortunately, we default in the moment to autonomy, and every one of those decisions is defensible. So you and I are good buddies. We're going to the theater. You say, gee, I really want to see that rom-com. I say, there's that new Schwarzenegger film. I really want to see that. Well, yes, we're only sitting side by side. We're not talking during the film. Nobody wants to listen to two people talk during a movie. So we're going to shut up. But if you go into your movie and I go into mine, which happens all the time, when we come out, we've got nothing to talk about. We have no shared reality anymore. And so there's 10 zillion ways where we cause a problem. And so somebody would say, what difference does it make? Your movies start at the same time. Make yourselves happy. Go into the one you want to see. Don't compromise. And at one level, that decision makes sense. But another level, if you and I do that often enough, we end up with no shared reality, no life together, nothing to talk about. And not only is that happening at the level of friends, it's even happening at the level of married partners. They're spending more time alone today than they used to 20, 30 years ago. They're less likely even to go together to friends' houses. And we don't know exactly what's going on, but what I suspect is that you have a very tailored way that you want to exercise. I have a very tailored way that I want to exercise. Why not just go to our own gyms and do our own thing? And then that list just goes on and on with every aspect of our life, right? And unfortunately, because autonomy and connection are in constant tension with each other, what that means is we probably should be making more compromises with our eye on the long-term goal of connection rather than the short-term goal of, I want to be happy and choose the very perfect thing for me right now.
Yeah. I have to ask, if someone's the boss, the leader, you sort of need certain traits. And it's interesting. I had a conversation with somebody, a gentleman named Rich Davini, who talks about leadership, which actually is completely different than I'm here to tell you what to do, right? It's to create an environment for everyone to be their best, be accountable. You're able to make a decision, some pretty great qualities. But I'm curious, when dealing with that, like, let's say someone is in this role of leadership, where almost you're sliding in and out of it constantly, because you have to sort of be guiding the ship, looking ahead. Maybe you're the most experienced person, but then you need to be empathetic. You need to kind of understand what personalities you're dealing with. Do you see that a lot of people who are, let's put it, in charge, kind of better in a different way than we would think of clicking in and out of those gears?
That's a great question. When I think about the leaders that I interact with the most, they are almost never out of leadership mode. So I feel like they're actually, but they're doing a great job with everyone else. You show up at their office, you ask your question, they give you their answer, they connect with you in the moment. They're not looking at their calendar, they're talking to you, they take your ideas seriously. And then they're off to the next one though. And so I don't know. I don't know any of these leaders well enough to know, well, what happens when they go home? Do they put it aside? But I do know that good leadership is a combination of autonomy and connection balancing constantly. But what I don't have a sense of is are they really ever slipping into connection mode, or am I only connecting to you right now in order to get you to go off and make those widgets that we need so that I can, keep the
right.
boat afloat?
If it's a strategic connection to feed the greater goal. Yeah. Interesting. You've talked, a little bit, and this is a little side conversation though, about like one of the things we're hardwired for, and this is obviously is comparison, right? I mean, we don't want to disrupt. I heard a great thing about, let's say if you wanted to manipulate someone's beliefs, you could do, for example, like a show, and someone could say something kind of radical, but before you had time to process it, they would then say a joke right after. And then the studio audience would laugh. And so you would be like, oh, well, they think it's funny. And so you would never get the time to actually process your own opinion about what you just heard. And because you don't want to disrupt the tribe, you were like, oh, I guess that's funny. So kind of a brother or a sister to that is constant social comparison. And I'm just curious, how that kind of plays a role in some of these dynamics.
Well, social comparison has two really important sides. On the one hand, there's this informational component and the kind of wisdom of the tribe. And so I look around and everybody else, the smoke pouring under the door, let's say, and everybody else doesn't seem bothered by it. So fine, I'll ignore it too, because even though the house is on fire, the consensus is that everything's okay. And so we 99% of the time, what everybody else thinks is actually valuable. And so we tend to default to rely on that information. But there's a second side of social comparison. We not only want to know what others think in order to understand what reality is, but we also want to know where we stand in the list. And the problem is, this is where comparison is the thief of joy comes from. Mm-hmm. And so, if I just learned that I got a big raise at work and my salary just went up 20%, I come home and tell you and you go, oh, I work next door to you and my salary went up 40%. Immediately, instead of being happy with what I got, I'm unhappy because it doesn't compare well to you. And on the one hand, that's stupid because the world's not a zero-sum game. You can if I'm making more and you're making more, well then great. Now we can go on cool vacations together. But the downside of of the problem is that the world is a zero-sum game when it comes to status. And so it used to be the case in the small societies that we lived in, you could be the best at something. There were so few people in your group, you could stand out in some way. Now, as you said earlier, nobody's the best at anything anymore. It's impossible to stand out. I remember I was just reading somebody complaining about LeBron, like he's not a good enough athlete. I'm like, how patently absurd is that you could take one of the world's greats and say, but I know somebody who can do this better than he can. But when you live in a world with this many billion people, there's always somebody who can do it better. And so that's the downside of comparison for our world now, is that no matter where I look, I'm always can be made to feel bad because I can find people who are doing better than I am. And so if you let yourself, and this is a little bit why doom scrolling and replacing your life with the online stuff is bad, because there's so many curated images of wonderful things happening there that my life sucks by comparison. Yeah. And that just makes us feel bad.
Yeah, it is so fascinating. What are we supposed to really, we're not really, I mean, we're supposed to be around 150 people, right? Or something like that. And then an occasional stranger. And now I have access to thousands of people's curated lives.
Yeah. Yeah. And so it's not only are we kind of built for a world of 150, but in reality, there's really about 30 or 40 people who are reliably in our group. And then if we did shift out of that group, there was 30 or 40 people who we already kind of knew, but we would now get to know much better. And it's in a sample that size, you're always going to stand out. If you're a reasonable human being, you're going to be you're going to stand out in ways that people value you. Mm-hmm. It's so easy to go utterly unnoticed in today's world and not be valued because there's just too many of us. I mean, not too many. There's a lovely amount, but there's so many of us that our psychology hasn't adapted to it.
Yeah. So if I'm listening to this and I'm like living in my parents' downstairs, let's say, cause it is when you and I came out and go, we're going to become adults and take on and do a career thing. It was a lot easier. And I loved it. You talked about, if you think about our ancestors, they didn't even think about like, well, what am I going to do for a job? Hunter gatherers are like, we're just going to survive.
Right.
But let's say someone's there at that place and they think the idea of trying to connect with another person has really become daunting to me. It's become, I'm scared.
Yeah.
Were there any stories in this of people who were experiencing that and then small things that they could do? I mean, I'm talking about, never mind making the effort to just be around the people that you have relationships with. I mean, starting relationships.
Yeah. Social anxiety is debilitating. It's really hard. And it's increasing because, we're not forced into each other's company anymore. And so the main thing that I would say is, you have to know yourself. You have to say, all right, well, what am I willing to do? And then whatever that is, I wouldn't say totally leave your comfort zone, but I would say push it a tiny bit. And so, maybe you go to the same coffee shop every day, and you get your coffee, but you always just leave and go home and drink it. Maybe now sit there and even just read a book or look around, or, you feel like you're in a spotlight when you're in a social setting and you're not socializing, but the reality is you're not. We all feel the spotlight, but it's an illusion. How often are you looking around a restaurant going, why is that person alone? You don't do that, right? You're busy worrying about yourself. And so I would say if you've got that anxiety and you're afraid to get out there, try to add little tiny bits to your daily schedule. And then hopefully you can find a level that you're comfortable with. And hopefully you find that it's actually kind of enjoyable. If it's not, that's not the domain, and try it somewhere else. And it can mean, it could be, even just things that are online at first, where you like to play with online gamers or whatever the case might be. One of the things I love about the online world is that you can erase your presence when you're not wanting to be observed, and then you can reappear. And it'd be nice if, I've been at many parties where I'm having a great time. I'm in a conversation, and then that conversation ends. And now, well, where do I go next? It'd be nice to just disappear while you sort that problem out. And so online can allow that. And there's no harm in that. And so if that's the way to get the ball rolling, then that works too.
Yeah. I know that's why I always even like the idea. And I know people don't love gyms, but like even a YMCA or something, it's just like a hello. Sometimes people don't realize those you can build upon a hello.
Oh,
with
big time.
somebody.
And so in my case, I love to rock climb, and I mostly go to indoor gyms because I don't have time to do the big expedition to the cliffs, even though I love that and it scares me. But so mostly I'm in the gym. And what you don't realize is if you keep going to the same place all the time, even though you go alone, you actually make up a large collection of people that you kind of know that are sort of friendly with you and you say hello to, and, oh, hey, how did you solve this problem? And you could be painting or at a studio. You could be working out at the gym, anything. In those public settings, those micro level social interactions, especially if you keep going regularly, and especially if you can go at the same times on the same days, you'll start to get to know people who go at the same time as you. And you'll suddenly realize, oh, I've got a fair few people that I would regard as something of friends because we share interests and we're friendly to each other. And that's a start.
Yeah, it really is. So just two more things I wanted to ask you about is, sometimes people go through lives and they're sort of different. They change or new extensions of themselves. And people will use the word reinventing. And I always say I don't think it is a reinvention. I think it's the continuation. And if people are willing to go with it, then the story will change because we change.
Yeah.
I think this is scary for a lot of people, but it's also necessary.
Yeah, so we just don't have the same motives as we go through lives. I mean, it's not surprising that your 16-year-old self is not the same person as even your 26-year-old self, much less your 56-year-old self. And so, as you're, who is it? It wasn't, I can't remember who said this, some famous jurist, I think, that a foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of small minds. You don't need to strive to be the same person because in many important ways you are, but you're a person who's now learned, hopefully, and is a little bit wiser, hopefully. And so you're a person whose goals change. And I look back on myself in high school and college, and a lot of the times I think, what a schmuck. I was such a brash, annoying, unkind person in domains where I didn't have to be. I could have been kind then and I wasn't. And so long as you're self-forgiving, because, that was the schmuck I was a long time ago and I'm trying to be a better person now, you can sort of laugh at yourself and it doesn't bother you. So you want to forgive your prior self, but you also want to improve it. We evolved negative emotions for a reason. We want to feel guilty when we do the wrong thing. We want to be ashamed when we make a fool of ourselves so we don't do it again, right? It's all about self-improvement.
Yeah, it is. And I think if the people are still in your life that you were not your best self with, you can go back and apologize.
Yeah.
It's okay. I mean, the hard ones are people that maybe you had some kind of friendship with, but you don't really know them anymore. And you're like, well, they'll just remember me always as that kind of knucklehead.
Yeah. There's a cute movie where I think Adam Sandler, somebody just starts calling people that he was mean to in high school. And one of them was about to go postal and he goes, oh, thanks. Good timing on the call. And so you could, in principle, you could do that, but reality, you can't find them anymore.
No, it's too hard. Another thing I love is that you talk about is like, when these changes that we're talking about, but also the opportunity to thrive in that. Obviously, one of the scariest things for people, you could say, hey, the outcome's going to be better, but you just have to change your behavior or you're going to have a change. We're all scared of it. It's uncomfortable. We get habitual. I'm just curious when you study this idea of like thriving through change or unknown, or things that are uncertain. If there's traits or attributes that really are
it's
helpful.
hard for everybody. But the key thing to remember about uncertainty is that it's also the spice of life. And so, for example, there's some really lovely research that shows that if you get a certain reward, your brain gives you no dopamine hit at all because you knew it was going to happen. But as that reward becomes uncertain, then as you start to get closer and closer to it, you get this big dopamine reward and it makes you happy. And so if somebody could tell you all the things that are going to happen in your life and every one of your successes, that would be the worst thing that could ever happen to you because then you would never enjoy any of it anymore. Your brain has evolved to think, I knew that was going to happen. And so uncertainty is painful and you worry about tomorrow. It's where anxiety comes from. That's this future oriented machine we have that made us such a success. But it's also the one thing that makes us happy more than anything else when we do land those uncertain rewards. And so as times become more uncertain, they become more intimidating. But I tell you, the most intimidated I ever was in my life was around when I turned 50, and suddenly it looked like the rest of my life was a straight road. And it was a good road. It was like, I loved my job. I loved my family, but I was like, I'm looking at the rest of it. And it really threw me for a loop. And so, mind you, it's turned out to be a whole lot curvier than I thought it was. But the bottom line is that uncertainty is both a cost and a benefit. And without it, life almost becomes no fun at all.
Yeah. Well, it's just like it's like that slow death, it's just,
yeah,
it is interesting because we don't give ourselves enough credit that we can keep expanding and adding regardless of how old we are. And, I know you've also studied, aging and the brain. And I just love this conversation about things that your brain or age actually reveals about your brain.
Well, the thing is that, as we age, senescence is never a good thing. Nobody wants to get older and fall apart, but we evolved to do it for very good reasons. There's animals, reproduction is so hard. Surviving through all the predators and pathogens is so unlikely that we've evolved to put energy into reproduction and care rather than cellular repair. And so we just don't live forever. Mm. And, as humans, I'm not sure that it's a good thing to live forever. I'm not sure, when you watch these movies where somehow they crack the code and they become immortal, it's super intimidating to me to think about being immortal and how bored I think I would be. But setting that aside, as we age, our brains shrink and we lose a lot of what we call fluid intelligence, the capacity to do new things quickly and easily. But what we gain is crystallized intelligence. We just know a lot more than we used to before. Mm-hmm. And we also gain this sort of peace with what we're going to be and where we're going to be. And so if you look at people's life happiness, it actually is higher as they get older because they're at peace with the route that their life is going to take. And they've replaced the things that they can't do anymore with things being better at the things that they can do. So when I had a ski accident a few years ago, and I'm sitting in the emergency room, and they put a scan of my brain up on the screen. I'm like, oh no. And the people I'm with are like, why oh no? I was like, there's a whole lot of atrophy on that brain that I did not want to be there yet. And the person I was with says, oh, you just had a concussion. You're probably misjudging that. And the neurologist is like, no, he's not misjudging that. That's a brain that's starting to atrophy. And that's fine. It just means that, maybe I have to plan around that. And, you have less brain reserve. You're not going to be able to do some things that you could do before, but you can make up for it by being able to do other things. And that's just the process of getting older. And it's not necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah. I had a neighbor, Joe. He was in his 80s and he was caring for his wife who had Alzheimer's pretty severely. And she was actually bigger than him. So I don't know if caring for somebody, it's a lot of work.
Yeah.
And, he was a really exceptional guy. And we were driving home one day and he was by the road. So we stopped to see him. And I was like, Joe, how are you doing today? And he said, I'm good. He said, and I just know that like acceptance is a part of life.
Yeah.
And I thought, oh, that's a much bigger idea than I'm even going to grasp, and I think a lot of these things that you shared in this book are really the reminder, though, for all of us that we do live in a world that is not maybe set up for us to get those kind of deep natural wisdom lessons that we got from living, 200 years ago, whether it's rites of passage or living on the land or being in storms or whatever the things that taught us, maybe what's really important. And so we have to actively go out there and try to bolt this into our lives.
Yeah, we're evolutionarily mismatched to our current existence. Our ancestors never went to the gym because life was a workout. And so we now have to create an artificial version of that. Yeah. And we have to do that in many ways. And the biggest advantage that they had with regard to our happiness is that they were around each other all the time. They were never alone. Yeah. And maybe they walked off to be alone for 20 minutes, but you're not going to go off alone for a long time because you turn into lion food. And so being around others is what we've evolved to be. And unfortunately, we don't have to anymore. And as a consequence, we've kind of separated ourselves from that. And so for me, that's the big lesson from our ancestors. Yeah. We could have, if we'd evolved now, we would be perfectly happy alone. Lots of animals are, but that's not us. We're not a happy alone animal. We're a happy together animal. And so you need to make sure you design your life to be together.
Yeah, I really appreciate the book and the message. And if there's anything I forgot or an invitation that you wanted to remind people before I let you go get the puppy, will you go ahead and put it out there?
Yeah. Actually, I think this is a great discussion. I don't think there's something that you've forgotten. The downside for me, which is the downside I think for all of us, is that identifying problems is easier than fixing them. And so you ask a lot of great questions about how to fix these things. And I think I know partial answers, but I don't know complete answers. And what I always want to remind people is that, life isn't off the rack. It's very bespoke. You have to do what works for you. And so whenever somebody gives you advice that doesn't fit you, don't do it. There's no harm in saying, well, I'll try that, but I don't think it fits, because you may be surprised. But you know yourself pretty well. And so choose solutions that work for you. And so, if you're an introverted person, you're not going to want to do a lot of the socializing that extroverts will naturally enjoy. Go to parties where you don't know people. It's going to be great. You're like, no, it's not going to be great. But that doesn't mean that there aren't versions of socializing that you can do and that you'd really benefit from.
I really appreciate that. And you're not suggesting, and I just want to remind people, you're not saying, hey, like you need 50, just a couple people. I think what I was told, it was that there was somebody to call. Yeah. Like if you felt like you had somebody to call for real, that's like a really pretty good starting point.
You have to remember that it takes work, because they have to be able to call you. And so if you look at our ancestors, they formed these really important, really tight relationships that have a lot of responsibility. You have to look out for them too. Yeah. But that's what we evolved to do. Looking out for them is good for you. You feel good when you do it.
That's right. And I think that's actually as much of the equation. Being able to be there for somebody when they really need it is, then you go, oh, now I get to be a good friend. Yeah. And that has implications, emotional implications that beats any, I'm the winner, I'm the CEO. Yeah. It's quiet, it's deep, and it's incredibly rich. And obviously we don't live in a world that's like, yay, for those things, but it really is.
Yeah. And the beauty is the yays come from inside, because the data show that providing social support is bigger on your happiness than receiving it. Yeah. And so it's a huge part of what it means to be human. And you won't get 14 thumbs up in whatever platform, but they'll happen inside you. Your brain will reward you.
Yeah. Well, Bill, will you remind everybody all the places that they can find you and even your other books?
Absolutely. So this book, the most recent one, is The Social Paradox. The prior one is The Social Leap. They're available on kind of any platform, audio, etc., every bookstore. When I finished my second book, my publicist said, now you've got to get on Instagram. And so I'm newly on Instagram and I'm learning how to do it, but I'm really enjoying it. And so anybody who wants to can find me there. And people even reach out to me on Instagram and ask me questions about it and stuff like that. And I can be found on the web more generally. And so LinkedIn, places like that. And so if people have questions and comments, I'm always interested to hear them.
Well, William von Hippel, thank you so much for your time and for the work. And like you said, it's not about, hey, do everything that, it says in the book. It's just take bits and pieces and try to build that into your weekly, daily life. And that just gets you a little bit further ahead. So thank you so much.
Totally my pleasure. Nice to chat with you.
Thanks everyone for spending some time with me. Hopefully you got something out of it. If you did, feel free to share it with your friends and don't forget to like and subscribe. And also, I want to hear from you. Tell me what's working, what's resonating with you, and how you're getting it done. Keep going.